Proposing your research. So this video will be broken down into 3 sections. First, I want to introduce the topic, and it's very important you understand what the committee is there for, what they are looking for, and the things they need to ensure to sign off on your proposal and then eventually your defense, because that's going to help you understand why the research proposal is written the way it is. Then we'll get on and we'll talk about the proposal document that you have to submit, and that's roughly, think a 10 to 20 page document summarizing everything about your proposal. And then, of course, you'll present that to the committee, so there's a presentation. And these requirements vary from university to university. This is how it's required at my university, so if you're not required to do the proposal document at your university, feel free to ignore that part, except the questions that are answered there and the topics that are covered are very important to include in whatever or however you communicate this information to your committee. Introduction. What is the purpose of your proposal? Well, your committee has to make a decision of whether your plan is worthy or not. Now, ideally, your proposal comes early in your research. All too often, this happens way too late in the research, and the reason that some faculty do this is so that there's less questions from the committee, because if you're far along and you have a lot of questions already answered, well, that's just less questions that they could ask. They'll have more confidence that's a valid direction to go in, and so on and so forth. I think that's a shame. I really do think this should go relatively early, just to make sure that everything about your proposal, if you're successful, that is worthy of a PhD. So really, what are the things that the committee has to consider to ensure that if this research is done, that they would sign for your PhD? One, is the research new enough? If what you're doing is not new, then you're not generating new knowledge, and that's what's required for a PhD. Is the research significant enough? If nobody cares, if it doesn't do anything, then it's probably not worthy of a PhD. Is the research difficult enough? It's not enough to solve a simple problem. Even if that simple problem is important and new, your research has to be difficult enough to be worthy of a PhD. A PhD is somebody who's demonstrated that they can be an independent researcher and solve difficult problems on their own. So if it's not difficult enough, well, that's not enough to earn the PhD. Is your topic well defined? If the committee is a little bit confused of what the topic is and what you're doing, well, they're probably going to assume you are confused, or you have an incredible inability to communicate your ideas. Both are problems for a PhD. Is your plan achievable? Right? If your plan involves time travel or something that just can't be done at the university, or something else makes it unreasonable, maybe you're proposing to do incredible things in 1 month. And so if your plan's not achievable or realistic in some way, well, they're going to have issues with that. And it's also good to catch that early. The committee wants to know how you're going to measure your success. What are your metrics? And they really like you to be as quantitative as possible, because if you don't throw these metrics in, there's no way to measure if you are successful. Now, you might be thinking, well, I kind of want to do that on purpose. Well, if they don't know you're successful, you could also come to your defense, and then the committee says, yeah, but that's not enough. You're going to have to do this other stuff because there is no measurement in place to say whether you're successful or not. So it's also to your benefit to be quantitative there. And the last thing, will your research be sufficiently disseminated? So are you going to publish? Are you going to create posters and put those out there? Your research, even if you cured cancer, is absolutely meaningless if you don't communicate those results to other people. So that's a really, really important part of being a PhD and earning your PhD. So this does need to go in your proposal document, how you plan to disseminate and get your research out to the public. Here is the trick that not a lot of people talk about enough. When you're writing your proposal, very much think like a lawyer. The proposal is really a contract between you and the committee. And you are telling them, if I do this and only this, that is sufficient for my degree. And then they would sign saying yes. So it's just as important to say in the proposal what you will do as what you will not do, because that's the agreement between you and the committee. So at the end, if you finish everything you said, the committee can't come back and say, yeah, but that's not enough. We want you to do these other things. Whereas you can point out, no, in the proposal, I said I wasn't going to do those things, and you all signed saying that was sufficient for my PhD. So very much think like a lawyer here, and don't leave the committee any reasons to fail you at the end because they think you haven't done enough or haven't accomplished what you said or weren't quantitative about it, so they can't measure your success. Make your proposal airtight that way. Proposal document. Well, this is where things are going to get a little bit boring and dry, but it is really important to understand how to outline your proposal. Also, keep in mind that requirements could change from university to university. So these are the requirements either that my university imposes or I myself would like to see in students that are proposing. I think mostly here it's what I like and what needs to be presented. And I've never, ever had a problem with students that have followed these outlines with their proposal or their defense, because all of the questions a committee could possibly have is there. Anyway, the proposal document starts out with a one-page summary of everything. When you write this, pretend that for the committee, that's all they read is this one page. So literally everything needs to be there. Your hypothesis or your problem statement, why it's new, why it's novel, your scope, your objectives, and how you're going to do your research. Be very brief, painfully brief, and this is difficult for a lot of people, but it is absolutely possible to fit all that into one page. That said, it's time to go into the background. And this is where in your proposal document, you need to establish yourself as a subject matter expert. And you've done your literature searching. You know what all the concepts are, you know who the key players are, you've done all of this. So you need to describe the history of your topic from the Big Bang up to just before your research. So the entire history and state of the art and who all the key players are, what they've done, and how they've contributed. You're not yet going to get into your research. That's the next section, but all the way up to, but not including your research. And by the way, if you've done any prior research, and that's very common, you might join a group, you hop around, do a bunch of different things, feel free to go ahead and stick that in there, even if it's not really targeted towards the topic. You might work in one topic and then switch to another and say, okay, that second one, this is definitely going to be my research topic. You can go ahead and put that first one here. That is absolutely fine. To build on that background, you've taken the reader from the Big Bang up to, but not including your own research. This next section is where you're introducing your research and how you're going to build on the state of the art to do something that is new and novel. So you're going to outline your research topic. You're going to justify how that is new and novel. You're going to describe the technical approach. This is where you go into the theory of what you're doing and why you think it's going to work. From there, now you actually outline your research plan. You're not so much discussing theory here. That came in the previous section. Here you're just laying out what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, and that's it. So it starts off with scope and objectives. This may be the most important part of the proposal because this is where you're saying what it is you're going to do and what it is you're not going to do and how you're going to measure that. Every objective should have some kind of metric with it to know if you've met that objective. You'll follow that with a schedule of tasks and milestones. So think of this as a Gantt chart. You're not going into too much detail of the tasks here. You might add a few words to talk about the flow of tasks at a high level, but for the most part, this is just a Gantt chart. And you also want to lay out milestones. So these are sort of intermediate stages where you can say, all right, I've achieved this, and then you can go on to the next step. And that might be you develop a certain algorithm on your computer. That's your first milestone. You've got that algorithm working. Your next milestone might be you use that algorithm to design something you're going to do. And when that design's done, that's your next milestone. Then you'll build and you'll test, and then you maybe have to revise it, build another test. But in the end, you have a working device. That's a third milestone. So the milestones are just sort of these intermediate steps that measure your progress. And you'll plot those on your Gantt chart and describe those. You'll list your research deliverables. So these are things like publications. Maybe you do a demonstration, maybe you do some outreach and you do something at a high school, all that sort of stuff. You'll then go into the detailed description of your tasks. That's maybe 1 page each, where you actually describe what you will do. Again, you're not necessarily discussing theory of what you're doing. You're just discussing what you're going to do and how you're going to do it and what the outcome of the tasks will be. Then go on, you'll have your performance goals and quantitative metrics, probably summarized in a table, and you'll definitely end your research plan with a dissemination plan. So you've done all this wonderful research. How are you going to get that out there? And then the last is your list of references. More than 100 references is typical, and there is no fixed number. There's no minimum or maximum, but if I see 10 references at the end of a proposal document, I immediately think to myself, has this student really done a thorough literature search? Now, maybe there is only 10 papers out there. I seriously doubt that. And so you really want to have a very rigorous background. This is, if the most important is scope and objectives, then the second most important is this history and state of the art, where you establish yourself as the expert. And so then you can go on and really argue more intelligently why what you're doing is new and novel. Let's talk about these sections in more detail. Before we get into this, I want to talk about the difference between a hypothesis and a problem statement, because most people out there say it is absolutely necessary that you have a hypothesis statement. And I would agree with that if your PhD is very scientific in nature. And a hypothesis is simply some kind of statement about what might be true. And then you go ahead and you do your research and you figure out if that is true or not. But in engineering, very often we don't have a hypothesis statement. Instead, we have some kind of problem statement. And it's 1 or 2 sentences that just explain what are the key problems that your research is going to address. So engineering is much more applied that way. And it's perfectly okay. Don't let a science person who got a PhD tell you as an engineer that your PhD in engineering has to have a hypothesis statement. Very often it will, but very often it does not either. I've never heard of a science PhD having a problem statement. That seems to be reserved for engineering. So a little more about this hypothesis or problem statement section. Here you're stating, what is your topic? Why is it important? What is the state of the art in the field? So you're talking about what have others done, what problems have been solved, and where is the bleeding cutting edge, because your research has to happen on the other side of that to contribute new knowledge. Then state your research hypothesis or problem statement, and it should be pretty clear by the time you've described all this background how what you're doing is going to build on that. But don't leave it up to the committee. Go ahead and state very bluntly and clearly what's new and novel and what will your research contribute. Try to justify why your research is hard, why it's PhD worthy, why nobody has solved this problem before. And then last, touch on the scientific and societal impacts if your research is successful. So assuming everything goes well with your research, what happens? So what? How is science advanced? What can other scientists do with your results? How does it affect society? Could society change in the future? Talk about all of that. All right, so the proposal summary. When writing this section, pretend this is the only section the committee will read. And you know what? That's probably actually true. Committee members are very busy. It's rare they're going to read your whole proposal document. Yes, that's disappointing. Yes, that's wrong. But it is reality. So use that to your advantage and write a very nice proposal summary that really addresses everything that they may be concerned about very bluntly, very clearly. So it's got to include your problem statement and your hypothesis. You need to justify your novelty and significance, why it's important, what's the impact if you're successful. And then Again, thinking like a lawyer, lay out your scope and objectives. What will you do? What will you not do? What are your specific goals? How will you accomplish your research? What's the work plan? At a high level, discuss your tasks. There's not a lot of space here because this all needs to be less than 1 page. How are you going to measure your progress? Quantitatively. And so how are others going to know if your research is successful? And that's the metrics that you've come up with. So all this should fit on 1 page. And even ideally, there's a figure here. But that's not necessary because there'll be figures later. The background section. So again, you are discussing the history from the Big Bang all the way up to the present, just prior to your research. So who's working on this field? What have they done? And bring the reader, the committee member, right up to today. So by the end of reading that section, they should have an awareness of 2 things. What is the state of the art, and that you're an expert and you have a knowledge of what is state of the art. Then you can end this by discussing what are the problems or limitations that the state of the art currently have. What is missing? What could be better? And then you can very briefly, but really this can happen in the next section, state how your research will build on that and contribute new knowledge. And optionally, you can include any prior research that you may have done in your group or from another group or wherever leading up to this. The proposed research section. This is the section that builds on your background. In fact, some people even just include this in the background. I think it needs to be its own separate section. So the background has taken the committee member or the reader from the Big Bang all the way up to, but not including your research. Then you introduce your research with that background, how it's going to build onto that. What is your technical approach? This is the place where you talk about any kind of theory of how your device is going to operate or how your experiment will work or your concept. Talk through that. So it's not necessarily the tasks yet. You're more just teaching the concepts and the theory of your research. You definitely want to identify here the significance and novelty of your proposed research. So you'll take everybody up to the state of the art in the previous section, but then you advance it in your research. And that's important because, and then you describe all of why that's important and how it will impact science, how it will impact society or engineering as a whole. Then into the research plan. This is probably going to be the longest part of your proposal document. And this is the one where it's especially important to think like a lawyer. And that's right here in this scope and objectives section. This is where you're laying out what you're doing and what you're not doing. So I like to start this off by talking about the overarching vision. So this is a vision outside of your specific research. And the overarching vision probably has a lot to do with your advisor and what their mission is, their vision for 20 years down the road for that research group. Then you'll get into, well, what is your specific research and how does it fit into that? Then you're going to go on and address what fundamental questions you're answering. What are you going to do? What are you not going to do? Don't forget how important what you're not going to do is, because you don't want to end up at your defense and then the committee says, okay, but we want you to do this extra stuff. So you want to lay out here very specifically what you're doing and what you're not doing. Okay, then to meet these goals, what are your specific objectives? Now, technically, objectives should not depend on each other. If they have to depend on each other, then somehow we're starting to confuse tasks and objectives. Now, that actually becomes very difficult, and a lot of people mess that up. So I'm going to relax the definition of objective a little bit and think of objectives instead as entities that if all the other objectives fail, that the one objective that didn't is still valuable and important. Now, you may not be able to graduate. I'm more just talking about what are objectives. And then definitely, what are your metrics for success? And you'll probably have a table in there, and you'll list these different metrics and maybe your target value and maybe what is even current state of the art. And that way, at the end, people can measure your success. and agree to it that that level of success is worthy of a PhD. All right, then you go on to your schedule of tasks and milestones. As I mentioned previously, this is really just a Gantt chart, and you lay out your schedule of tasks. You'll put little stars or bullets on there, somehow identifying where your milestones are, and you'll probably even have a little bit of a description below that of your milestones and how those are meaningful and how they're sufficiently measuring your success. You'll have a quick section summarizing your research deliverables. Maybe you'll say, I'm going to publish 4 journal articles. I'm going to present at 2 conferences. I'm going to demonstrate to the committee my thing when I'm done. I'm also going to submit a written dissertation. Or is there anything else that may be delivered at the end? After that, here's where you'll get into the detailed description of tasks. For the proposal document, I think somewhere around 1 page per task is sufficient. But as I mentioned before, I'm giving you estimates for page numbers, but don't put a whole lot of merit into that. There's really no minimum or maximum here. I just think it gets a little silly if somebody submits a 200-page proposal document, whereas something like on the order of 20 pages is very sufficient. So in these tasks, each task is associated with an objective. You want to identify which objective that task is addressing. So you want to describe the task, and you want to say what the outcome of that task is. What work will you perform? Are there any metrics for success that this task is addressing? Is it related to any milestones? Are there any risky elements of this, and how are you going to mitigate those risks? Or what are you going to do if something goes wrong? And it could be something like a piece of equipment has to work, or who knows, or maybe if you can't get one thing figured out, then the whole rest of your research just sort of falls apart. So what are these risky elements? And be blunt, be clear, identify them, and try to have a plan of what you're going to do if those fail. What's your plan B? And then last, absolutely have a dissemination plan. How are you going to get the results of your research out to the public? So these are usually papers, but also posters, conference presentations, any outreach activities you might do. Maybe you work with your advisor to get your research incorporated into the classroom. Maybe you're a guest lecturer one day and you talk about your research. So anything that communicates your research to the broader public is considered dissemination. Definitely have a dissemination plan in there. Your references section. Remember your background. This is probably where most of the references are going to be. You have to establish yourself as a subject domain expert. And if I see a research proposal with only like 10 references or so, I get very skeptical if this person has actually done their literature search. And don't think you're wasting your time, because that history background section will then also go into your dissertation. Just copy and paste it. That's absolutely fine. But greater than 100 references is very common. I would not try to have the mentality that you're just going to keep adding references until you exceed 100. Do your best at your literature search. And if you don't come over 100, well, maybe you haven't done a thorough literature search, or maybe you just have that new of a topic. That's really cool. So there may be reasons you only have 10 references, but in general, I see 100 or more. Now, when you get that many references, I'll throw an aside here. Definitely consider using a reference manager. There's Endnote, there's Mendeley, Zotero, there's probably others out there, but don't have yourself manually entering these references. So imagine you have 100 references, and then you want to go back and add one, and you need to add that between references 1 and 2. If you don't have a reference manager, you're going to have to go back and manually renumber everything, and it just gets out of hand. So a reference manager does a lot of things, not just managing the referencing in your paper, but a way to organize your PDFs. They very often do a lot more. So definitely use this kind of tool. I provided a template for your proposal document. These are the pages. And so you could do little more than just fill in the blanks, but I list the sections. I list the key questions that you should answer in each section. So definitely use that for your proposal document if you're required to do that. Proposal presentation. This will be a quick part of the video because we've been through everything that goes in your proposal document. There's no information that goes in your presentation that is not already in your proposal document. The proposal document is the more comprehensive thing. So there's very little new to talk about here. It has all of the same information, just in presentation format. And definitely follow the rules for a proper presentation. And so that means simple slides, minimizing text, using professional graphics to communicate as visually as possible. Definitely check out my other video on how to give a presentation and use that here. I also provide a template for your proposal presentation that has all of the different sections, and the highlights there list all of the questions that you should be answering. So feel free to go ahead and use this. And I think if you use these templates and get all of the questions addressed clearly and bluntly, you won't have any problems with your research proposal.